Excellent. So, well, how many people out there would describe their mental state at this point as perky? Okay. Oh, there's someone that's perky, so let's test him for performance-enhancing drugs of some kind. But anyway, appreciate you all staying. So I'm going to talk about coverage with evidence development. This you've heard from some from Dane Dixon. A few other people have mentioned it. It's a potential reimbursement mechanism to help kind of promote the generation of evidence of clinical utility. But really, it's also going to be kind of an entree into digging into one of the big elephants in the room, which is what's it going to take for payers to pay for these things, and how are we going to define what the standards are for reimbursement. So I'm going to answer that question. Well, okay, not exactly, but I just thought you'd stick around if I said I was going to answer it. But I will talk about it more. So so coverage with evidence development. So basically, it's reimbursement by payers linked to patient participation in some kind of clinical study. That's all it is. And the way it's set up, of course, is that the payer gets to decide, which technologies it's applied to, what the research questions will be, and what the study design will be. So it basically, was kind of developed with the idea that it gives payers some leverage in terms of making sure that studies are designed to answer the sorts of questions that they're interested in, like clinical utility. And the point of coverage with evidence development is, at least as Medicare implemented it, was to try to allow earlier than normal access to promising technologies while promoting studies that confirm, that they actually benefit patients. So that's what it is, and just kind of, diagrammatically, I'm not one of the people feeling perky today, obviously. And Dane, you kind of used the term, transitional technologies or something, but so the basic notion is that whereas the yellow bar here, if you think of this as, the time to develop evidence and sort of increasing level of confidence that, an intervention improves health outcomes, a normal sort of the usual standard of, adequate evidence, which is how Medicare says what's reasonable and necessary, would be where that yellow bar is. I guess on this scale, I would say, well, with this morning we talked a lot about, the wild west of next-gen sequencing or something. I guess that would be somewhere, towards the left here. But the blue bar on the left would be the lower level of evidence that would be a trigger for coverage under evidence development. And then further to the right would be, the trade-off here is it takes a bit longer to actually get the confirmatory evidence that, that you have something that's medically necessary, et cetera. So again, the notion here is very similar to adaptive licensing or accelerated approval in the regulatory context is, earlier decision making with sort of a greater burden, if you will, of post hoc evidence generation. So that's the notion. And Medicare used this a number of times, probably a dozen in total, but for everything from lung volume reduction surgery to PET scanning for suspected dementia. It was in the mid-2000s. Expansion of coverage of implantable defibrillators for primary prevention of sudden cardiac death was provided under a CED with a registry requirement. The most recent national decision of CED was coverage of transcatheter aortic valve replacement, a big collaboration between the Society for Thoracic Surgery, American College of Cardiology, big national registry, and then the folks at Palmetto, including Dane Dixon, Elaine Jeter, and Mike Barlow, have recently issued what I think are the first three sort of coverage with evidence development type decisions by a Medicare regional contractor. So I don't know that there were ones before this, but that's sort of broken the ice in terms of doing this at the regional level. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So here's what I just kind of want to point out is, CED is one of those policy mechanisms that is tremendously intuitively attractive. It gets talked about all the time, and it is, a bear to actually make it work. So, there's the the highways are littered with kind of the carcasses of CED efforts, both, in the U.S. and internationally. So, there's many ways for it to fail, or at least not, be fully successful, I guess is the more optimistic way of saying it. But in order for sort of a coherent framework to be implemented, first of all, you need to develop criteria for which kinds of technologies are going to potentially be eligible at all. It's a ton of work to do this for the payers, for the companies, for a lot of folks. So you only want to do this for technologies that actually have the potential to significantly improve health outcomes and or reduce healthcare spending. And I'd say generally, molecular diagnostics, next-gen sequencing probably, as a class, falls pretty well into that category, right? We've heard a lot of exciting things about it. Where it gets more difficult is you need to actually define an evidence standard for, that blue bar on the left, which is what constitutes sufficient evidence to decide something's promising but not medically necessary. And you have to kind of define what the, what the evidence bar is on the right-sided blue bar, which is what kind of study is going to give you sufficient evidence to decide that you no longer need CED, that the technology, can be generally approved. So where that kind of leaves us is, and how I'm going to get into sort of talking more generally about the evidence standards and reimbursement, how they tie into CED, is we've kind of taken, one problem, which is deciding when payers can decide something's medically necessary, and split it into two, maybe equally difficult problems, which is how do we decide when it's promising, and how do we decide what kind of evidence is necessary to, validate that it's medically necessary. Folks didn't really talk about the Medicare actually has some guidelines at the national level for, what constitutes medical necessity for diagnostic tests. It's sort of two questions. Is the evidence adequate to determine that the test provides more accurate diagnostic information than an existing test? And if it changes accuracy, is there evidence to determine that the changed accuracy affects health outcomes? So Medicare's standard is definitely not impact on changes in practice. It's impact on, patient health outcomes. So that's kind of, there's a lot of different definitions of clinical utility. I would say the easiest and sort of most straightforward is some level of evidence that patient health outcomes are improved, and that's traceable to the use of the diagnostic. Here's where things get a little, muddy, because if you actually read a number of national and local Medicare and other payer coverage decisions and what they cite as potentially supporting the conclusion of medical necessity or reasonable necessary or clinical utility, there's published prospective or prospective retrospective trials that retrospective data alone is inadequate to demonstrate clinical utility. I think Dane Dixon and Paul Meadow, that's probably, right from some of the slides you saw earlier. Then there's included in widely accepted treatment guidelines such as ASCO and NCCN. So you'll actually see some language that basically says virtually de facto, if it's in an NCCN guideline or ASCO guideline, it'll have clinical utility. Now, as we saw earlier today, ASCO guidelines and NCCN guidelines don't always agree with each other. So in some sense, this isn't so much an evidentiary standard as it's delegating the assessment of evidence to a process that you trust. Then there's services are delivered by providers who have specific training. There's some policies that will link the conclusion of clinical utility to collecting ongoing data on outcomes. Then you'll actually see some policies that say it's sufficient to provide physician surveys that document that physicians report that they changed their practice based on the results of the test, and that is not an unusual thing to see in a coverage policy. So so actually, a lot of those studies are actually done. I've even seen studies done that have triggered reimbursement where they gave physicians kind of sort of samples of clinical scenarios and ask them how they would, make a decision based on that if they had the test results, and using that as information of clinical utility. And then there's actually a currently, and I won't identify the test, but there's currently a draft coverage decision out there that says proposing to non-cover a test because the perceived level of oncologist enthusiasm is relatively low. Well, this is questionable enough if it was just level of enthusiasm, but the perceived level kind of means it's not my impression that people are all that excited about it, so we're not going to cover it. So all that's really meant to say is these can't all be right because they're quite different from one another, and I don't even think I've captured the full range. I was going to say this is all the same payer, but it's not true. So that's a little bit of exaggeration. But the point is that I can imagine it's pretty difficult for someone in the venture community or in the diagnostics industry to kind of come up with a clear clinical development plan if part of their purpose is, targeting to, what's gonna, have a reasonable likelihood of getting me reimbursement. So that I think is, a problem, and I think we've heard about it other times today, which is, and I would think most folks in the room kind of share this view that part of the problem is not just that the payers won't pay. Part of the problem is we have no idea what it is necessary to do so that there's a good likelihood that they will pay, right? It's sort of undefined. So this is where I've, and by the way, this Secretary's Advisory Committee on Genomics, Health, and Society in 2008 actually had identified this problem themselves and recommended, they said clinical utility is critical for managing patients, developing guidelines, making coverage decisions. HHS should create a public-private entity of stakeholders to establish evidentiary standards and levels of certainty required for different situations. Is there anyone here that works for HHS? I'm just wondering if they did this, but if they did do it, I'm not aware of it. But it seems like it's kind of responding to, the problem that, at least I'm alleging. So this is brought up as a new term. I'm just trying it out publicly for the first time today, the need for reimbursement science. I know to Richard Shilsky this sounds like an oxymoron, but it's meant to be, well, let me kind of explain what it means if it's not self-explanatory. So we all know what regulatory science is, right? It's the science of developing tools, standards, and approaches to assess safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of all regulated products. That's what it says on the FDA website. And then the goals of regulatory science are to speed innovation, improve regulatory decision-making, get products to people in need, to protect and promote health of our nation. So in other words, the point of developing methods and providing clear standards in the regulatory context is that there are multiple objectives that you're trying to achieve. One is to get new products into the marketplace, but another is to get things out there as fast as you can, and another is to promote innovation. So there's multiple goals to a regulatory framework. And the reason that regulatory science is important, now we're getting into kind of a philosophy lesson, so I'm sorry to do this to you late in the day. But anyway, and I just made this up, so it may not be right, but anyway, I'll try it out on you. Why do I think why do I have the perception that regulatory science is important? Okay, so first of all, there's several legitimate social objectives related to medical products, right? You want to make sure they're safe and effective, rapid patient access, promoting innovation, and then minimizing the burden on product developers. No unnecessary burden that's not required to protect public health. So these objectives create tension with respect to evidence standards, right? If the FDA is demanding too much evidence for approval of products, that's, well, they'd maximize, public safety and assurance of effectiveness, but they'd potentially kill innovation and prevent early access. So the whole point of regulatory science, in my view, is that it provides an opportunity to collectively develop a scientific framework that optimizes and balances multiple social objectives. That's the whole point of it. And in order for it to work, it has to be kind of a sustained, iterative, interactive process. Like you heard our friend, is it Litwacker from the FDA or? Yes, Did I get your name right? So you guys are going through, I guess, a 9-year process from now to kind of, slowly, innovate in the sort of the regulatory oversight of laboratory developed tests. And it's involving public meetings and public comment periods and lots of interaction with stakeholders. And part of you being out here today, I think, is part of that process. So that's the process by which you actually, I think, develop oversight mechanisms that optimize, different legitimate social objectives. That's what regulatory science does. And of course, in the regulatory space, the FDA is kind of the natural place for that to happen. That's part of their job, right? Their job is to, accomplish these things. So they can't just sort of, shoot from the hip and say, okay, here's how we're regulating LDTs. Just, live with it. We don't care what it does to the diagnostics industry. We don't care what it does to patients. That's not the way it works. So where I'm obviously leading up to is nothing like this exists in the reimbursement space, right? So payers basically just get to say, oh, well, a randomized controlled trial, or sorry, it's not going to work, right? But payers don't have any less obligation to, be responsive to, something other than what their primary function is. So we're now in a situation, right, where, and I think everybody knows this, access to new products is no longer ensured by FDA approval. If you talk to any of the investors in life sciences, they all say, well, the FDA is moving in the right direction, so we just don't know what to do about the payers, right? It's sort of, and that's driving a lot of, honestly, it's driving a lot of money away from life sciences into health information technology because, they know what the rules are there, they know what the marketplace there is, and, the reimbursement is just too unpredictable. There are increasing demands from payers for evidence of effectiveness. There's many different payers with many different standards. I sort of talked about that earlier. And there's multiple legitimate social objectives that are impacted by reimbursement. So access to therapy, innovation, safety and effectiveness, and this last one, value for money, which is an affordability, which is not a consideration in the regulatory context, but is actually a serious and legitimate concern of the payers, right? Because the job of the payers is not to pay for everything. The job of the payers is to kind of allocate resources to where they're most efficiently used, unless you assume that resources are infinite. I would say, by the way, reflecting this morning's comment about would I want NGS for a member of my family? Sure, I'd want NGS for a member of my family. I'm not sure that means that my insurance company is obligated to pay for it. Right? That's a totally different question. So anyway, the point is, we have in the reimbursement that affects things like innovation and affects things like affordability and cost of care, but there's actually no platform where these issues of reimbursement science get discussed. So I'm proposing a definition for reimbursement science. I decided to say it here today because the people who are staffing this from the IOM are obligated to put this in their workshop report. So now I can say it's actually written up as opposed to something I just made up. So reimbursement science, the science of developing tools, standards, and approaches to assess comparative effectiveness value of products covered by public and private health plans. And then the question mark is, instead of the FDA, it's like, well, who will advance reimbursement science to speed innovation, improve reimbursement decision-making, and get products to people in need to improve population health outcomes and efficient resources. So this all is a, is a long around way of saying that I guess what the SACGHS had proposed about a kind of a collective multi-stakeholder effort to define evidentiary standards, if HHS is not going to do it, I think one or more of the partnerships that we've heard about today, and I think it does have to be a public-private partnership, will sort of have to take on, deciding, looking at these questions of what's the appropriate science and how do you efficiently generate evidence to address questions of clinical utility. I think it's doable, but as we've heard today, there's a lot of complexity to this, a lot of different points of view, but I'd be interested in, well, the last thing I'll say is I think in a meeting like we have today, I think it's pretty good for sort of problem identification. As I said, I think the only way we're going to get progress with this is some kind of mechanism where the dialogue is sustained, gets into the technical details, is highly iterative with the multiple stakeholders, because that's the only way we're going to make sure that it's not just the payers kind of dictating what the standard should be, but the payers in dialogue with all the other key stakeholders and who have equally legitimate social objectives. So thanks very much.